Welcome to the Feminist Exec, the podcast where women in leadership share their stories, challenges, and triumphs. I'm your host, KP, and together we'll dive into the real talk behind breaking barriers, leading with impact, and redefining success on our own terms. Get ready to be inspired, empowered, and equipped to take your leadership to the next level. This is the Feminist Exec. Let's forge your future. Welcome to the Feminist Exec podcast. I am very excited today to have Annie Kell with me. She is a sustainability leader. She's a building performance expert, and she's an advocate for resilience and impact. She's had a long career based in engineering and sustainability, and I'm really excited to talk to Annie today. Welcome, Annie.
Hi, happy to be here.
So let's get a little bit into sustainability right off the bat. So where did your interest in sustainability come from? Was it a specific moment, a place, a person? What sparked it?
So where I went to university, we were required to take a certain number of classes outside of our major. So my major is actually in astrophysics, which is not really relevant to what I do now. And one of these classes I took for fun ended up being around social impacts of sustainability and a little more around the thought process of what it means to be sustainable. And I remember doing research on the impact of electric vehicles, and they were at the time touted as like, this is going to be the saving grace for how vehicles and transportation in general is causing air pollution. But when you dive into it and you see how they're manufactured and learn about these rare earth minerals that they use and all that, it really created this question of what does it mean to be sustainable, and opened up that can of worms a bit of, hey, we can't just create sustainable solutions in such a siloed manner, and triggered that overall thought process. I started taking a ton of sustainability classes after that, and it rapidly evolved into a career trajectory change.
So astrophysics. So you're a huge nerd. What was the thing that brought you to astrophysics as a major in the first place?
I loved the concept that there was something out there bigger than us. Astrophysics is the study essentially of how space works, which we don't really know how it works, right? We make very educated scientific guesses and estimates and well-informed assumptions, but there's a lot of it that still feels like a mystery. And I liked the concept of feeling so small in the grand scheme of things. It puts a lot of things into perspective. So it was an interesting field to study for sure.
It doesn't seem too far off from sustainability because it's the pale blue dot, as you will, keeping our place in the universe. So I want to get into a little bit about your career, and then I want to talk a little bit more about some of your leadership journey. But before we do that, outside of work, what's something that people might be surprised to learn about you?
Ooh. So when I'm in networking environments and all that, I can be pretty chatty and pretty open. And I think people are often surprised to find out that I'm naturally a bit of an introvert. So outside of work, I really enjoy like working in my garden and reading. And I do enjoy spending time with folks, but I get a lot of energy and fulfillment from more of like a slower paced life outside of work.
And you have a family as well.
I do have a family, yes. I have two small children. One just turned 6 and the other one is a very feral 2.5-year-old. So yeah, it's a fun and exciting time for sure.
I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more, how you balance life and your career. Before we get into your career journey, if you could wave a magic wand and make one sustainable change happen in your city or your field, what would that change be?
I think one of the biggest barriers we face right now is this perception of what sustainability entails and what our goals are as sustainability professionals. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to create a more global awareness of what the purpose of sustainability is and the fact that everyone does care about it, whether or not they realize it. Because I think we could create such amazing change if we actually had a more universal buy-in. We have the technology, we have the intelligence, we have the people out there who could make this happen, but it's just about showing them the value of, hey, we know how to do better, so we should do better. So if I could just make everyone believe in that, that would be amazing.
If only we all had that power, right?
Yeah.
So walk us through your career path from your start, from finishing college, changing over to sustainability, and then where you are today and what types of things you're involved in.
Absolutely. So I By the time I graduated college, I knew I wanted to work in sustainability. My experience working in general had been very research heavy at that point. So I did start out working in an internship at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here in Colorado, doing research around the manufacturing of solar panels and how we could do it a bit more efficiently, a lower cost, but also kind of quickly realized that the lab life was not really for me. A lot of that work, while really important, does take a very long time to come to fruition where you'd see the impact of what you're working on. And it's also a bit lonely, like you're in a lab all the time. And I know I just said I'm an introvert,
I
but
was going to ask.
yeah, I know. I do actually like being around people during the day. So I find it a little more engaging and fulfilling. And I had a really good conversation with someone. I had just started cold calling people trying to figure out what it is I might want to do. And I had a good conversation with someone about transitioning maybe more into the buildings industry and what that would look like. And they're like, well, you really only have laboratory experience, research experience. You don't have any experience how to deal with clients or how to deal with projects out in the real world. And if you can get that experience, you'd be a good candidate to transition into more of like a consulting role in sustainability. And so I actually worked for Accenture for a couple of years, big consulting firm doing just systems integration consulting, nothing related to sustainability. I did volunteer with some sustainability work within the company, but I didn't actually get paid to do any. And then a role opened up with a firm here in Denver, a small woman-owned business engineering firm to do building energy efficiency type work. And I reached back out to this contact and I said, hey, I took your advice. I worked in consulting for 2 years. This position opened up. It looks like you know people at this company. Any chance you'd get me introduced? And he introduced me to the owner of the company. So it was a great way to get engaged with this small company. And they gave me a chance, which was, I didn't have the background for it aside from saying, hey, I learned physics, I know thermodynamics, and I have a minor in energy sustainability, but I'd never really worked in buildings before. I'd never looked at building drawings or anything like that. So they helped teach me about all of that. And after a few years of doing energy audits, we did a lot of energy performance contracts, which is when you use the savings from installing energy efficient measures to pay back the loan essentially that you would take out to cover those measures.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a really cool mechanism. A lot of affordable housing, a lot of affordable housing communities use it in different parts of the country. And after a few years of doing that, I talked with our sustainability team at that company and said, hey, this is what I really want to be doing. And they let me move over. And ever since then, I've been doing sustainability consulting for buildings, mostly new construction. And then about a year and a half ago, after being with that firm for 10 years, so I grew up there, which was just wild when you think back on it. But I was given an opportunity to move to the company I'm at now, Burns McDonnell. They're a very, very big firm. I went from a 60-person firm to a 14,000-person firm. They're trying to build out their sustainability services. And so I now am their sustainability services delivery lead, trying to help coordinate on how the company in general is approaching clients about sustainability work, whether it's creating a more holistic package of services when we're talking about proposals or just pulling in the right resources internally. So it's a whole new type of job for me, but it's been very, very interesting and still really touching that sustainable design world.
There's so many threads I want to pull there on what you just said.
Oh.
From your early days at Accenture to joining a woman-owned business, using networking to find your job, and then going into a leadership position. So why don't we start with maybe the early days, the Accenture days? You mentioned you did consulting. This was leave on Monday, come home on Friday type of consulting work, right? The hit the pavement. What did you learn from that experience? And did you bring anything from that experience forward into your consulting skills now?
That was an interesting time. It was very much, it very much felt like, okay, you're a junior staff. Here's what is expected of you on paper. And it's different than what's expected of you in reality.
How so?
If you meet the expectations that are laid out on paper, you are underperforming. And that was often reflected in how they did career performance things. Like if you left the office at 5 o'clock, you were considered an underperformer. And it felt a bit like they were just trying to get as much work out of us as possible. For the level I was at when I was there, the average tenure was about 2 years. So people would come in, they would get trained up, they would burn out, and they would move on to something different. So it was good in the sense of it taught me a little bit about working in a more corporate role, but it also showed me a lot of what I did not want in a work-life balance. And again, traveling Monday through Friday every week meant that I had no life where I actually lived. I couldn't attend networking events. I couldn't attend social events during the week with my friends. And by the time the weekend rolled around, I was usually very tired. And it was hard to live a life outside of work in that type of environment.
So you really learned what you didn't want to do with the rest of your life, which I think is really valuable for so many people as well. As, people get hung up on this, I want to do something, but they forget to think about what they would rather not do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it helped form that perspective of appreciation for when I worked at this other small company that had a very different approach to work-life balance. It kept that perspective in my mind, for better or for worse, for a very long period of time.
So do you think it changed your definition of success? Like, how has your definition of success evolved? Especially, you mentioned earlier, sustainability is like a field where progress is slow, complex. You're consulting on new businesses and buildings. You went from Accenture to a smaller business. How has your definition of success evolved over time?
I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. As far as for personal success, when I initially made that transition to the other smaller firm, the definition of success for me was getting to do meaningful work with a company that walked the talk and getting that work-life balance. I really could live a life in addition to doing my work. I've hit a point in my career, and it's part of what triggered the transition, where for me, the definition of success now also includes getting to have the impact that I would like on the world. And so the company style and the type of work the company does is vastly different now compared to where I was before. But the scale of work is also vastly different. And that's where that opportunity really opens up. Now, the interest is still there, of course, in having work-life balance, but I also feel like it's a bit of a fluctuating goal, right? There's trade-offs as you go throughout your career. As far as success in a business sense, I think my time at this smaller firm really showed me that you can have a successful business and successful projects using benefits for the environment, beneficial social impacts, and all of that as a bottom line. They're a B Corp, they're a just certified corp. So they don't have shareholders except for like the general public and the environment, right? That's how they operate. And it was still a wildly successful business. It still is a wildly successful business. And I think having that perspective is incredibly helpful because it can be very easy to get kind of blinded by some of the ways that corporate companies perceive success, where you're always looking at these, monetary numbers and employee numbers and project numbers, and it's all about constant growth.
So digging into that just a little bit as you're thinking about getting your sustainability initiatives across the line and as you're looking new in your role in the last couple of years, what are you doing or how do you see stakeholders see the value in what you're doing with things that maybe they can't always see right away or measure right away? What are some of the things that you're really doing to get people on the same page with you?
We are in a beneficial position right now, which is a funny thing to say, I guess, given some of the other changes happening at a government level. But sustainability now has been almost mainstream long enough that we now have the data and the evidence to back up this concept that it is good for business. Some of that ties into just all of the investments that companies have made, where it would actually be detrimental if they pulled back on some of the sustainability work at this point, but also they are starting to see the payoff of having done some of the upfront sustainability work, whether it's saving on energy costs, whether it's better employee retention because they're showing that they care about sustainability, or better client retention. It is something that the majority of people care about. There is a very interesting tool out there put out by Yale that's this map that shows it's like a climate opinion map. And the idea is that the sentiment around sustainability is really like this silent majority. A lot of people don't talk about it. And for a lot of people, it might not be the most forefront issue in their mind. But 72% of Americans believe that we should be operating in a more sustainable way. There's some numbers get different once you get into what's causing climate change and how important is it and all of that. As far as how we engage with stakeholders and help them see the value, I think a lot of it these days especially is having a conversation where you're understanding what their values actually are and demonstrating that sustainability really ties into that. I listened to a great talk recently where the speaker was talking about how sustainability in and of itself is actually not a great word. It doesn't describe anything. It's very vague. And as people hear it, they associate it with a wide variety of things. But in its essence, it's really this concept of we know we can do better, so why don't we do better? And it covers everything from energy security to environmental health to public health to disaster resilience. And at the end of the day, it is very easy because it's so broad to find a way to tie people's values back to this core concept of sustainability. Even if we have to call it something different, which these days a lot of times we do, having those conversations with someone who doesn't necessarily think that they care shows them that actually you do care. This has benefit for you, however you want to label it. The basic policies and ideas behind it still apply.
So the net is sustainability is good for business. And most of us maybe aren't running sustainability projects in our day jobs, but we're recycling at home or drinking out of paper straws and the like because we want a place for children, grandchildren, the world to be a better place longer term, right?
Yeah. And I think also, even if you aren't like a recycling whiz at home, a lot of people think that having clean water is really important, for example. And that falls into that concept of sustainability, or they want, their kids to still experience the biodiversity that they grew up with when they went for walks in the neighborhood, woods. So that's where it really does tie into a lot of our core values. There has been a pattern historically of putting the onus of sustainability improvements on the average person. And I think that's also where the movement has really suffered because it really shouldn't be at an individual level. The impacts, negative and positive, need to happen on a much larger scale than putting this constant level of responsibility on people that are already working really hard and already have a lot of other things they're focusing on.
That's a really good point, especially nowadays. People are, they're managing their jobs, they're trying to put food on the table, they're trying to have work-life balance. The last thing they want to talk about maybe is sustainability. But your point about sustainability being more than just recycling, more than just the paper straws, it's the biodiversity and being able to take a hike or go to Yosemite or Glacier National Park and enjoy the animals. It's living in areas that are disaster prone and having sustainable architecture that doesn't have to be rebuilt every time a hurricane comes through, right? So things like that maybe directly connect to people's day-to-day lives, but they don't think about being part of sustainability. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think, there's, especially with a lot of the movements around sustainability in the 90s and early 2000s, it was really positioned as like, oh, we have to save the environment for the sake of saving the environment, which I also believe in. I think it's our responsibility since we're having such big impacts to take care of our natural places. But at its core, it's the definition of sustainability is that we want to leave future generations the resources and ability to lead and live the same quality of life that we have. And right now we're robbing those future generations of those resources. And so it does end up being very human centric. And I think that's what a lot of that message gets lost a lot with people.
Yeah. I think your other point too is really important about the burden being on the average consumer versus being on the businesses that do have an outsized impact on the environment. And speaking of outsized impact on the environment, I know AI is on the top of everybody's mind. I literally am on calls every day about how to leverage AI. There's data centers being built all over the country and all over the world to be able to handle this extra capacity, compute power, and energy. So how do you see AI impacting your role in sustainability? What are some of the things that you're thinking about as AI becomes more mainstream within these large businesses that you said have an outsized impact, both positive and negative, on sustainability?
AI is a tricky concept. There are immense benefits to it in the sense of it can optimize a lot of things, which is really great. And you can achieve efficiencies that way. I can see the benefits of it. And I can also see that we're kind of in it at this point, right? Like we're not really backing out of AI as a society. My hesitations with AI come in a number of ways. I think we are already, as a species, very disconnected from the natural world. And I think that this pushes that even more. It takes away even more of the human interaction that we would have. And that concerns me a lot. Instead of going and talking to someone and getting advice or working together with someone, people are turning to things like ChatGPT to get answers and have discussions and feel like they're having interactions with people. I think we will continue to see an increase in this essentially loneliness epidemic that really started when social media and smartphones really became popular. AI also is a huge suck on our resources. So data centers typically are constructed in areas that are big, wide open green spaces. They're not constructed in the middle of cities. So they are actively eating up biodiverse areas, areas that could be farmland. They are building at an incredible pace. We work on a lot of data centers, which is the other tricky side of it, because the work is very interesting and they are doing some very, very cool, sustainable approaches to data center design and construction. But at the same time, the pace at which they're being constructed is just wild. And they use an incredible amount of water and energy to run. Um, and I'm not sure that the benefits are worth the risks or worth the impacts that they're having. But again, I'm not sure we can really slow down that momentum at this point. My other hesitation around it is just I studied astrophysics. I read a lot of works and papers and listened to a lot of speeches from a lot of top physicists, including Stephen Hawking and all that, who warned us a long time ago about the impacts of AI on our society. And so those warnings still kind of come up in my head quite a bit when I see how much we are starting to lean on it as a society.
Lean on not only AI, but the internet. We had a big outage that's relevant, to this conversation around Amazon Web Services, and whole business platforms were down. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was wild. And I don't think I had realized just how many other widgets and companies utilized Amazon Web Services until I heard the full plethora of things that were unusable yesterday.
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit because you have two young girls and you yourself are a woman in probably a fairly male-dominated space, probably since college, if I'm not mistaken, from astrophysics all the way to consulting and some of the things that you're doing on sustainability. What's your experience been, and how do you start to talk to your girls about their futures?
Yes, I did start in a very male-dominated industry. And I would say the buildings industry in general is also very male-dominated, with engineers and contractors and architects. I have been very lucky in that since I've moved into the buildings industry, it's been 90% probably positive experiences. I've had some coworkers have less than great experiences, especially those in a more engineering-focused technical field where sometimes they get questioned in a not very kind way or they get treated a bit differently. But it is becoming increasingly less common, which is great. As far as the sustainability industry, at least within the networks I'm in, it is maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, actually female dominated, which has been really fun. Especially when your day-to-day work is not female dominated. Being in this industry where there's just a ton of support, and as a result, a ton of allies as well within the industry has been really lovely. It's just a very amazing, welcoming community. I am a part of the broader U.S. Green Building Council community. I've been a volunteer with them for 14 years, and they run these Women in Green events that have grown into some of the most popular events that they throw every year. So it really demonstrates the level of engagement that is happening within the sustainability community and with empowering women, and it covers all range of practitioners, from engineers to architects to folks like me that are more consulting. But I also, I had a not awesome experience when I was at Accenture with someone who was external to Accenture, thankfully. The folks internally were all great, and my boss handled it in a really supportive way. But it was I knew how lucky I was when I moved to the women-owned company to be in that environment where the owner of the company had started her own engineering firm as a female like 30 years ago, when there were very few female engineers, let alone ones running their own business. And so she had run her business in a very specific way as a result. And it had created this wonderful, very supportive community where it showed me that it was possible to hold boundaries with clients in the name of kind of protecting your staff. So sometimes people would assume that, if a client is not being kind to you or is coming off as a bit sexist, like, I'm not entirely sure how my manager would handle it if I said something. Hopefully that's less common these days. But at that company, there was never really a question about it. Our managers always had our backs, and that was the culture that was cultivated there, is that there just wasn't really a tolerance for people mistreating our staff in that way. It was a good environment to grow up in because it gave me the confidence moving back into a company that is more male dominated to have learned how to handle those situations in a way that was still tactful and maintained client relationships, but made staff feel like they were supported and someone had their back.
That's amazing. That's so cool that you had that type of experience, especially for such a large portion of your career. What else was different in your mind now that you've worked at large corporations, you worked at the small woman-owned firm, and now you're back at a large corporation? What else was different about working for a woman-owned company versus a traditional structured organization?
I think, it's hard because I think a lot of the differences do end up kind of coming down to the size of company, as well as the fact that the organization I was at before, all they believed in really was doing this sustainability type of work and energy efficiency work. That was their whole bread and butter. And because that was the driver, it allowed them to be a lot more public and open and progressive around how they operated as a business. And also, there's a lot more flexibility when you're that small. I think one of the biggest things I've seen switching over is just all of the levels that you have to go through to affect even the small change at a company of this size. But actually our company right now has its first ever female CEO, which has been great.
Wow.
And actually with that came the creation of my role. So I was brought on within a few months of her becoming CEO. And she has started creating a few major changes across the company that overall have been received very well. And I think one of the big things that seems to be a trend with women-owned businesses and other small businesses, but you don't see it quite as much in the corporate world, is work-life balance. So our company now has the 980 schedule where you get every other Friday off.
Awesome.
That was a really big change that was created a few months after I had started. I think it also comes having I've had female managers now for, I think collectively about 9 years. And there generally seems to be just a different level of understanding of, hey, I need to dip out and take my kids to a doctor's appointment or pick them up from school. And again, that's one of those things that I don't want to generalize too much, because I think there are also a lot of male managers out there, especially if they have young kids, that understand that dynamic. And I think it is improving rapidly. But definitely when I started, that was not as common from talking with other friends in other industries and other types of jobs.
Yeah.
That flexibility did not exist. COVID helped a lot, I think, also with people seeing a full view into people's lives and having to be more flexible. A lot more of that flexibility has stuck around post-COVID, which is great.
I also see, and I've heard that prior to COVID, early on in your career, mine as well, that the expectation of childcare, home duties often falls on the woman regardless of her employment status, and doesn't fall on the man, even if he is full-time employed. And once people had to come home and be at home, many people probably saw the work that their significant others, their spouses, their wives had to do to take care of what was going on in the house, to manage children and all the things going on. So maybe there was a bit of an awakening, if you will, of what actually goes into the life part of the work-life balance.
Yes. One can only hope. for sure. I think it did in my work life make things a bit more flexible.
So, as a woman, have you ever been told anything around your leadership style or communication style or work style that you felt was maybe directed or out off base in terms of whether you're a woman, like being too nice or, not being nice enough, things like that? Have you had any of those experiences before?
It's so funny. I think this is also one of those things that would surprise people from maybe my personal life a bit about my work life is I've been called intimidating and blunt. And I've definitely hit a point where it doesn't bother me as much anymore. A lot of it has resulted from interactions where I have held people to commitments or reminded them of previous conversations when they've tried to, you know, everyone runs into this, right? Something doesn't go right. Someone tries to make someone else look bad. And you're like, well, hang on a second. Can I remind you of this conversation we had? Or, I asked you for this already. And just kind of holding my ground against others triggered a lot of that, especially when I was younger. Holding boundaries as like a mid 20s, young 20s female in certain environments resulted in some less than kind comments and sometimes very personal comments from men. It has gone down in frequency as I've gotten older and as my titles have improved. That tends to come with a little bit more respect, but I still get called intimidating and very direct. And I've started to try and believe that it's a bit of a superpower in the sense of, okay, great. So does this means that we'll get the things done then, right? That we're talking about getting. And I'm never unkind. I believe in you don't always have to be the most liked person in the room, but it's important to be kind. But at the end of the day, I'm okay with people thinking that because I think it's reflective of me getting a lot of work done and making sure that it's done well. But I don't think I've ever heard someone call a man intimidating just because he was trying to keep them on a schedule.
That was going to be my next question is if you were a man, imagine what word they would use: direct, productive, things like that. I think there's still
Fishing.
efficient, double, ruthless in a positive way.
Yeah.
I've heard all of those be used in a positive slant towards a male colleague before, but it's interesting, the intimidating part, because, often, especially as a well-educated, very intelligent person, that can also be something that comes across. So what do you think really was that switch for you? Was it just time, or did you just wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I'm not going to let it bother me anymore"? What do you think was the switch?
I think a lot of it came from having projects go really well and stay on budget and show that the approach that I took with our work was successful. And there were even a few times where I had to really hold my ground with someone that I was working with that was not a part of our company, but we were both working on a project for a client, or in some cases, they were the client. And while they were not thrilled at the time, they always came back and wanted to work with us again and said what a great experience it was. And so I think it was that repetition over time that showed me that, like, okay, people might not love that accountability or that level of directness in the moment, but it does produce really good results and in a way that makes them still want to come back, right? And that's where I think that balance of like being kind, but holding a boundary has really worked well for me over my career.
There's a lot of talk about boundaries. I want to emphasize that being kind. I've talked to another guest about that as well. She said be kind. I think that's a really important point. But as you think about boundaries, what are some things that you used to help you with that? And what advice would you give to younger women and early on in their career that would like to enforce more boundaries?
Therapy. I'm a big believer in it. I think it's especially if you're anything like me and boundaries feel really hard, and you have a bit of a people-pleasing tendency, having someone kind of coaching you through how to handle those moments, and how to handle the feelings that come with it is really helpful. Also, having a good network of people within your industry, has been huge for me. As I mentioned, I've been volunteering with the U.S. Green Building Council for a long time. And with that, along with just other connections within the industry, I've generated a really close group of colleagues who have turned into friends over the years. And they're the kind of people you can turn to when you're having a bad day and you're like, tell me if I'm crazy, tell me if I'm over the line here. Like I just need someone to be straight with me and let me know, am I handling this right? Should I handle it differently? And having these people who understand your work and understand you to bounce ideas off of is so valuable. I think especially we're still kind of in that first wave to some extent of women getting into more leadership positions. I think the generation above us, it's still very few and far between, unfortunately. So it's harder sometimes to find a mentor-like figure who's also a female to look up to and to talk to about these, especially communication dynamics that we seem to have to navigate a bit more as females. But having that close group of friends has been very helpful just to help me stay sane. And also sometimes I'll send them an email the way I want to say it, and they'll help me make it sound a little bit less sassy, It's good. It keeps me sane.
I love that. I think there's so much in there about your network, the power of your network, being able to ask questions and have safe spaces to have those conversations so that you really can, check yourself when you feel like maybe you're out there or you shouldn't be reacting in a way, or maybe you should be reacting in a way. I know I've had some experiences where I'm like, I feel like I should be upset about this. And somebody's like, absolutely, you should be upset about this, And so sometimes that's very valuable.
Yeah, that validation can be very empowering.
Yeah. So you mentioned this transition of women leaders, and you told us about how your company now has a female CEO. You worked for the women-owned business before. You're a female leader. How have you developed your leadership approach, and what do you think is key as a woman leader in your field?
I'm trying to make sure I answer this one. It's because it's in a way that feels honest, because I feel like there's a lot of different ways to answer it that could feel like the right answer versus what you think, feels genuine. But I think it's a mix of a lot of like good and bad managerial styles over the years and feeling out what has worked for me, and also managing folks directly and kind of being that buffer for them between their level and maybe the senior levels. All of that experience together has shown me what I don't and do like from a managerial style, but also what is helpful to junior staff. I have had managers that have held me back. I have had managers that, even when they held me back professionally, were the most incredibly supportive managers from a personal level. Like I could do anything I needed to do to take care of myself, my family, totally understanding. And also, they didn't believe in my ability to do work above and beyond where I was at. And I felt like I was constantly convincing them, and that got very demoralizing after a while. But similarly, I've had managers that do push me a lot professionally and then know nothing about my personal life. And that also feels imbalanced. So I think for me, a key element to the leadership style I'm working on cultivating is really that seeing employees as whole people, not seeing them as, a piece of this big puzzle that is this big company, but rather like they have really important contributions. That's why they're here. And also, work is not their whole life. And that has been one of the big mindset shifts I think that's happened recently, especially in more recent generations of like, this cannot be our whole lives, is just focusing on our work. Now, some people do, like that is their whole life and it brings them a lot of joy, and that is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But for most people, they burn out because they don't feel like their actual life is recognized outside of work, and they don't feel like their value is recognized outside of work. And I feel like sometimes it's interesting because when I've managed junior staff, sometimes being just a little bit more real and direct and less of following the like company plan exactly and being like, woohoo, go company, has been really beneficial. Even talking to them about, what is your next steps after working here? What do you want to do next? Not assuming that they're going to stay put for life. Created an environment where they feel like they can be more open and honest, which also makes it feel like they can relax and therefore do better work. Historically is what I've seen. If people are comfortable and they're happy to be there, they're going to turn out way better work.
There's so many gems in what you just said. So I want to highlight a couple that I think stood out to me as you were talking. One is understanding the difference in the manner. I thought it was really interesting how you had somebody that I think some of us have experienced this, someone that's an amazing person, but maybe doesn't fully give you all the trust and respect work-life balance wise. And then the complete opposite, which is 100% work, but know nothing about what's going on in your personal life, which does have an impact on your life because, as you said, people are whole people. The thing that you said, though, that I wanted to pull out a little bit was, and I've heard someone else say this, my chief people officer where I currently am has said this, nobody's going to retire in this company, or most people aren't going to retire in this company. The change of careers has gone from 30 years at the same company to 10 years at a position to 3 or 4 years in a role, and then you move on. And giving people the right skills and the comfort, as you said, to be able to just thrive in the role that they're in right now. And then, maybe they stay longer, maybe they move into a different role, or maybe they move somewhere else. But that way you get the most from them at their time with your company. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think so as well. And it's interesting because both companies I've worked at in recent years, both still have this mentality of people are going to retire here. They're going to spend their whole careers here for different reasons, but that is very pervasive in both places. And I think sometimes can be a bit of a disservice to some of their employees, or at least how they see their employees, because there's almost this assumption that they'll stay.
So as you are looking at your career, and if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
It's hard to say because I've had a really good career so far. I think in my last role, I loved the company so much and I loved the people I worked with so much that I got very comfortable and I didn't push myself as much as I could have. So maybe a little bit of advice around pushing myself a bit more to stretch in that role. I would say to believe in myself a bit more. I think I let a lot of people's narratives about me, or even my own narratives about myself, get into my head. And I mean, I love my career. It's been great. So there isn't anything really drastic I would change. But I think there were times where I was capable of a lot more than I was doing at the time. And I could have stretched a bit more. So just having that little extra boost of faith in myself, especially as you get older and you realize that no one really has all the answers. But when you're young, you don't really fully understand that, right? That people are still kind of figuring out as they go. So yeah, I would tell myself just to have a little more faith in myself and try and reach a bit further.
Yeah. Being a girl mom, being in sustainability, what gives you hope right now in your work, your community, your generation? What's a nugget of hope?
Well, in on a more global scale, this concept of, we're not hitting climate thresholds and all that we want. The nugget of hope there is that it's never too late. It's really not, that we can start implementing widespread change at any moment and still reverse course enough to keep things livable, have thriving communities, have the next generation really be able to have the future that we'd like for them. As a mom of 2 girls, I mean, man, those girls are spicy. They are awesome. It is great raising them in this generation because there are things we are raising them with that we didn't even have growing up, let alone the generations before us. Like the normalization of professional women's sports is a really easy example there that just didn't really exist when we were little kids. It was considered this really far-fetched idea for women to become professional athletes, and not anymore, which is amazing. And also just seeing the dynamics that are changing as far as how people approach parenthood in general has been really refreshing. There is a lot more open dialogue around challenges about it and mental health, and trying to create this sense of community around parenting that I think hopefully to some extent is kind of getting rid of the stigmatization of whatever choice people make around having a family, not having a family, how they define a family, which is just better for everyone, right? We all feel happier when we don't feel like we're being judged for the decisions that we know are right for us, but also is creating a more supportive environment for parents and for the broader community. Like my girls have a dozen, aunts and uncles, whether it's actual family or chosen family, that support them and show up for them. And I think that that's incredible. In addition to, as I mentioned earlier, some of the flexibility that's come into this concept of having two working parents, especially with COVID, and how that has changed the narrative and the dynamic for a lot of working parents.
That's amazing. I don't want to ask you the question that everybody gets asked, which is, how do you do it all? Because I think that's overplayed. But what are some of the key things that you've learned from being a parent of two girls and managing a really successful career? What advice would you give? What are some of the key things that you have learned from your experience?
I actually don't think that the question, how do you do it all, is a bad question. I think it's one that needs to get asked more often as long as people give honest answers to it.
That's the key, right?
Yeah. The answer is that no one does. I don't do it all. No one does it all. I am very fortunate to have a lot of women in my life who are very hardworking, who are also attempting to manage families. And from my conversations with them, it's just not possible. And we are fed constantly this perception that it should be possible. We should be able to sleep properly and exercise and shower and have a fulfilling career and pack our kids' lunches and do creative crafts with them and keep on top of everything and have a clean house. No one does it. And I think that is finally the conversation that is coming up more, is this normalization of not having it all together and understanding where there's flex in your lives. My spouse and I often talk about this concept of glass and rubber balls. And we're all juggling a million balls, and the whole goal is just to not drop the glass ones. That one being like your relationship with your kids, the security of maintaining like where you live and having food on the table, some things like that. But like the giant mountain of laundry that hasn't, been folded and put away and has been sitting on the bed for weeks because it's clean, but it's just not put away, that's a rubber ball at the end of the day. Like, that is not reflective of having a successful, fulfilling home or life. I would say also there's definitely a point at which we start to outsource a fair bit. I have full-time childcare. We have someone who cleans our house, and we are very lucky for those things. And then we also have family nearby that steps in and helps us a lot so that we stay sane and are able to have our kids participate in activities without always having to step away from work to take them to those activities. I know folks who employ people to help them make all their food for the week for the kids, virtual planners, virtual assistants, all of that kind of stuff. These tools exist out there. And especially once you've hit a stage in your career where it becomes really demanding, in an ideal sense, you would also be financially able to afford some of that outsourcing. Now, I know that's a huge place of privilege to be in, but that is currently that, and the big mountain of laundry on my bed is how I manage it.
You just let the rubber balls bounce and figure it out. I love that it's such a visual thing too, for those of us that are visual learners. So this has been an amazing conversation. I do want to ask, what's one book that you would recommend that everybody read and why?
Oh, one of my personal favorites is The Overstory by Richard Powers. It's a really great book around kind of like our relationship with trees. And I know that sounds like kind of hippy-dippy, but it's a really interesting read as someone's perception of the significance of trees in our immediate lives and in the broader community changes. But it is more from like a storytelling standpoint, which I work a lot better with. So that is one that I think is really worth reading. And then I also think, from a climate perspective, Project Drawdown is a really helpful book. It lays out so many different approaches for what really is impacting this concept of like climate change and sustainability. And there is a whole section on there, whole chapter dedicated to the importance of empowering and educating women specifically, because there is a track record that if women have access to reproductive control and education, that those communities tend to thrive a bit better and use their resources better. And I would recommend it. It's a really interesting read for anyone who's interested in what our options are out there aside from like renewable energy and electric cars. There's so many different aspects of society that feed into where we are right now. And it's not just like oil and gas. There are so many elements of how we operate as a society and as a globe, which also means there's so many opportunities for improvement.
So you said The Overstory and Drawdown. I'll put links to those books in the show notes. But it does kind of bring us full circle around the sustainability piece where you started talking about, everybody was talking about electric vehicles and things like that. So What thing are you most excited about in the next year? Any final thoughts?
I think as far as something I'm really excited about is we're finally seeing a push within the industry for value to be assigned to nature, that there is actually like financial incentives for preserving nature or improving nature. It still has a decent way to go, but there are these financial tools out there, like mitigation banking and things like that, that really demonstrate, okay, if you would like to properly maintain this land or restore this land back to its like proper ecological purpose, there is downstream value in that. So that also brings me a lot of hope because it's, again, one of those things where it feels like sometimes sustainability operates a bit siloed. And for a long time, we've talked so heavily about carbon and energy that this overall ecosystem impact has been largely sidelined in a lot of industries. And I guess just like the last little nugget really is that I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that sustainability and this concept of sustainability really has value for everyone. If you think it doesn't have value in your life, feel free to message me or just take a look at what is most meaningful to you. If you have kids, is it the health of your kids? Is it being able to fill up your water straight from the tap? Is it, knowing that your power isn't going to go out on a hot day? Is it being able to go for a walk in the woods nearby? Like all of those things feed into that. The last little example I will leave with you, which is one of my more often used kind of cliche sustainability examples when someone feels like I have to really convince them of why this is important. Imagine that you, or if you have kids, it kind of works better if you picture this with your kids, have to put them in a fully enclosed room for 30 minutes. And one room has an electric powered car and the other one has a gas powered car. What room are you going to pick for yourself to stay in, for your kids to stay in? It's a very obvious answer because one you will die in and one you won't. And that's when you apply that at a global scale, that's what we're trying to do, is when you have all of these cars and all of this industry and all this manufacturing, at the end of the day, our atmosphere creates this room. And we are trying to have it be healthier than what it's been. There's no secret hidden agenda behind it other than just trying to make the world a better place.
Well, you've convinced me, which I know is your first wish. If you could wave a wand at the beginning, you said you could convince everybody to believe in sustainability. And I know I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners have learned a lot from you as well. So Annie Kell, sustainability leader, I'll put her LinkedIn in the show notes as well if you want to connect with her, ask her questions about sustainability or leadership. So thank you very much for being a guest on the Feminist Exec, Annie.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's a wrap on this episode of the Feminist Exec. Thank you for tuning in and being part of the conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. A special thank you to our composer, Peter Legault, for the original music. I'm KP, and this is the Feminist Exec. Until next time, keep leading, keep rising, and keep forging your future.